Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and dear friends, good afternoon, everybody, and you're all most welcome to this session. It is a great honor to welcome you all to the International Peace Institute and to this debate on from activism to accountability, discussing transitional challenges in the Arab world and beyond. I am particularly pleased to welcome Foreign Secretary William Hague to IPI. He has a very busy schedule for the UK presidency of the Security Council, but he has taken time off to share with us and also to share his views on this important topic. We have a very distinguished panel of speakers with deep insights on the challenging issues we are debating today. Unfortunately, the Foreign Minister of Tunisia could not be with us here in New York today, as earlier announced. But I'm very happy to welcome as our two speakers from civil society, Noura Yunus of Egypt and Salwa Bugaighis of Libya. Let me now leave the floor to our moderator, who is Barbara Plett, the UN Correspondent of the BBC, who will guide us through our discussion today. So once again, welcome to the International Peace Institute, and I look forward to today's debate. Barbara, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to welcome all of you here as well, those of you in the room and also those of you who are following our live webcast. We are hoping that this panel will provide an opportunity to take stock of the situation 1 year approximately after the beginning of the Arab revolutions. So our speakers will be looking at various aspects of that, at the role of peaceful protests in bringing about change, but also at the challenges faced by the new governments brought in and how to deal with them, and how activists can stay active by holding these new governments to account. Now, I think you all received programs when you came in that have the biographies of our panelists, but I'm going to just briefly introduce them to you in case you haven't thoroughly read those biographies. Of course, we have our host, William Hague, who needs very little introduction, the British Foreign Secretary, who's been a member of Parliament for 23 years, and he was the leader of the Conservative Party for 4 years. And on top of all that, he's a distinguished author of 2 historical biographies. Next to him here, we have Noura Yunus, who is an Egyptian activist and the managing editor of the website for the Al Masri Al Yom newspaper. I think she could probably be called a social media pioneer in Egypt. She's been using blogging, texting, and video to publicize the protest movements in Egypt. Most famously was her video of a textile workers' strike in 2007 that grew into a movement you've probably heard of, the April 6th strike, and was one of the forerunners of the mass protests that brought down the regime. Then we have Salwa Bugaighis, who's sitting on the other side of the Foreign Secretary. She is a Libyan human rights lawyer, one of 6 that carried out lawsuits against the Qadhafi regime and was persecuted by the authorities as a result. She's been very active in the revolution, helping to organize the Benghazi protests last February, as well as taking part in the coalition that ultimately led to the formation of the National Transitional Council, on which she served for several months. She is currently continuing her activism outside of government, advocating for human rights and increased women's participation in political life. And then, of course, we have Terje Rød-Larsen, who is the president of the International Peace Institute and has a well-known record of engagement in the Middle East. He helped establish the secret channel that led to the 1993 Oslo Accords, and he's held senior positions in the Norwegian government and the United Nations on the peace process, which I think most of us know very well, including one which had the rank of the Under-Secretary General. Now, in terms of how the panel is going to work, the format is for our 3 speakers, the Foreign Secretary, Noura, and Salwa, to give a presentation of about 8 to 10 minutes. Afterwards, we will have time for questions, about half an hour of time, and we'll go into more detail about how that will work later. And then we'll have some concluding remarks. And we will try to make it as interactive as possible because, as I mentioned, this is being webcast live. And if anybody is watching from elsewhere, we would encourage them to send questions or comments via Twitter to the hashtag A2A which is Activism to Accountability, 2 being a numeral, by the way. So now, if I could ask the Foreign Secretary to start us off with his thoughts about the Arab Spring.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here today during the United Kingdom's presidency of the United Nations Security Council. I particularly want to thank the International Peace Institute, which is known for its consistently rich and thought-provoking work on international peace and security, for kindly agreeing to co-host, physically host, this event. And I'm very pleased to be here with my fellow panelists. I'm enormously looking forward to listening to them and hearing what they have to say. And I think one of the most remarkable elements of the Arab Spring, as we've come to call it, has been the role that women have played in it, subverting stereotypes and playing a powerful role in the protests in many countries. And in societies that are still too heavily dominated by men, it is a pleasure to be flanked by 2 women who have been so influential in the changes that we are discussing today, and I hope they will be an inspiration to many others. This morning I chaired a debate in the Security Council on the challenges and opportunities for peace and security in the Middle East, and at that debate I made clear that despite all the risks, all the potential pitfalls and dangers, the United Kingdom is convinced that the Arab Spring is a force for good, and that the United Nations and its member states must continue to work together in supporting the people of the region as they demand their legitimate rights. And we must remain positive, we must persevere to help the states in the region towards reconciliation, consensus, and towards the new, brighter future that they are looking for. I've said for a long time that the Arab Spring is the most important event of the 21st century. So far, of course, we're only in the 2012. Some people say, well, is it more important than the financial crisis? Well, yes, it is, I think, probably, in its long-term effects. It holds the greatest prospect for the enlargement of human freedom and dignity since the end of the Cold War. And who would have thought that in a few short months we would see a democratically elected parliament in Tunisia with 24% of the seats held by women, free elections and a new constitution in Morocco, a new government in Libya. The scale and pace of change just in the last year has been astounding. And that pace of change has been partly fueled by a shift in the way that we communicate. Not entirely. Of course, there are many components of the Arab Spring. Long periods of dictatorial government, a lack of economic opportunity, people increasingly comparing themselves with the freedom of other societies. It has many, many components. But we live in an increasingly networked world now, and relations between states are no longer monopolized by foreign secretaries or prime ministers. There's now a mass of connections between individuals, civil society, businesses, pressure groups, charitable organizations, which are also part of the relations between nations and which are being rapidly accelerated by the internet. And the Arab Spring is, by its very nature, a particularly 21st century phenomenon. For the first time in history, we are seeing that collections of individuals, including from different countries, can come together to try to force governments to change course and reach a global audience in doing so, and can succeed in doing so despite in many countries being leaderless at the time, but coming together in their hundreds of thousands in order to voice their opinions. And of course, we can see this happening in countries that are very different from each other, countries that are arguably more distinct than they are similar, whether in terms of culture or history, geography or population. Libya, for example, is twice the size of Egypt geographically, but has less than 10% of the population and is ranked 60th on the UN Human Development Index, whereas Egypt is ranked 112th on the Human Development Index. And despite these manifest differences, last year they shared a common link, the determination to build more inclusive, democratic and open societies. And social media is part of what gave them the tools to make that happen. In these countries, this was one of a very few ways for citizens to make their voices heard and to try to reclaim their legitimate rights. And this might well be the first time that people living under autocratic rule have managed to document their struggles and movement, leaving a long digital trail of tweets, Facebook posts, YouTube videos, blogs, and So much more, tweeting the revolution has become a common catchphrase. So social media, in my view, have clearly played a role in accelerating events. And social media was able to carry a cascade of messages about freedom and democracy across North Africa and the Middle East, and helped raise expectations for the success of political uprisings. In its essence, social media became a critical part of the toolkit for greater freedom. The Arab Spring in Tunisia and Egypt relied heavily on the internet and social media, particularly Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube in the early stages. In Tunisia, 20% of blogs were evaluating Ben Ali's leadership the day he resigned from office, up from 5% the month before. The week before Mubarak's resignation, the total tweets about political change in Egypt soared tenfold. People throughout the region were drawn into the extended conversation with each other about what was happening. So by harnessing the power of social media, civil society has for the first time in many countries had the opportunity to shape the political debate. And this is something that is hugely welcome, that we should be in favour of. Space for a more varied and independent media is also emerging. Maintaining this space and recognising its importance is essential. When plural voices are heard, differing views aired, and diverse interests represented, it provides a balance in society. And what is now required is for opponents of existing regimes in the Middle East to use social media to identify goals, build solidarity, and organise peaceful demonstrations. The steps that these countries have taken and the progress already made is phenomenal, but the challenges that those states in transition face are now enormous. These countries need our help and support in order to deal with these challenges. It's not going to be a straightforward journey. There will be plenty of bumps on the road. But we must remain steadfast and unwavering in our support and help these fledgling democracies to grow. So let me outline 3 observations. First, while greater freedom and democracy in the Middle East is an idea whose time has come, the real economic challenges remain immense for many countries. While people in the region want to see a move towards a more democratic regime, they also want to see tangible improvements in their everyday lives, whether it is jobs or education or better way of life in general. And while the networked revolution has brought about startling political change in a relatively short space of time, it has also led to sky-high expectations among parts of the populations. Developing the strong institutions and liberal markets necessary to change the way that people live will take time, and there may not be the rapid pace of change that people, having paid a high price for their revolutions, expect. And this is why, through the economic facility of our Arab Partnership Initiative in the United Kingdom, we are giving funding and developing projects focused on creating jobs, supporting economic growth, and building accountable institutions. Second, we've got to continue to support the principle that the people of the region should choose their leaders. We must accept that we will have to deal with new actors and organizations that we are unfamiliar with. The rise of parties rooted in Islam reflects the values of many citizens in the region, and our role is not to pick winners, but to work with the leaders they choose in a manner consistent with our values and always upholding the highest standards. Whether governments are prepared to surrender power if rejected at the ballot box is the ultimate form of accountability, and so we must all judge new governments by their actions as well as by their words. And thirdly, it's important to remember this is a process and not an event. People mark the end of communism and the closing stages of the Cold War with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. But in fact, of course, Polish worker unions turned on their totalitarian regime as early as 1980, and Gorbachev's policy initiatives, perestroika and so on, were formed in the middle of that decade. And this is, in any case, a more complex and varied process than anything that happened in the old Soviet bloc. In the same way, the Arab Spring was always going to be a long process rather than an instant fix. And therefore, people will, in many respects, will need patience. But the international community must have patience too, and our support and dedication to the people of the region must be consistent and unwavering. I have been amazed by the strength and bravery of activists, lawyers, bloggers, journalists, and indeed citizens from every walk of life who have led change across the region over the past 15 months. And their enthusiasm and dynamism must be met by our own commitment and resolve resolve to stay the course and ensure that change is not a fleeting one. So we argue this is not a time to disengage in any way from these countries, but a time to redouble our diplomatic and long-term support to the region, while always respecting their freedom and right to make their own decisions and their sovereignty in their own countries. And so that is why, in our case in the UK, through our Arab Partnership Initiative, we're already supporting 47 projects in 9 countries that support the building blocks of democracy, including media freedom, voter education, involvement of women, transparency. So this is how we, for our part, will try to keep faith with people in the Middle East and help to fulfill their aspirations. Overall, we say now is not the time to lose faith in the Arab Spring, the Arab Awakening, whatever we want to call it, but to show the same boldness in our thinking as the people of the region have shown in their actions. So I've set out, as briefly as I can, how the British government is approaching these issues. And of course, I look forward to hearing many other ideas this afternoon about what more we can and should do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hague. I will go now to Nora Yunus, and she's going to talk about the role of peaceful protest in bringing about change and accountability.
Yes, thank you. Actually, I'd like to take you a bit back before 2011. I'll share with you an event that I personally witnessed. On the 25th of May, 2005, there was a demonstration against constitutional amendments put forward by Mubarak for a national referendum. On that day, the demonstration was called upon by the Kifaya movement, and on that day, the Mubarak supporters attacked the demonstration. They were beating the men, but only pushing them away to catch the women, sexually harass and molest them, tear their clothes, and grope their bodies. We were standing in front of the Press Syndicate, a famous protest spot in Cairo, and the area was full of policemen. And the police generals in uniform actually orchestrated the attack on female protesters, including female foreign journalists who were covering for CNN and BBC and all the other Western media. On that day, I remember a police general in uniform, he called for all of the women who were standing there to come at the entrance of the garage, and he said, "Bring the women here, I will protect you." So we helped each other, and we jumped to the entrance of the garage, and the man cornered us with, the general cornered us with his security men, and then he gave them order to open the way for thugs to come and molest the women who were cornered in the entrance of a closed garage. I had a very small camera at this time, so I took pictures of what happened and of the general. And later on, I posted those pictures on Flickr, and I came to know human rights lawyers and activist groups, which I didn't know before. And I filed a complaint to the public prosecutor. And in this complaint, it was against Habib al-Adli, the general, in his capacity as the Minister of Interior at this time, and President Mubarak in his capacity as the supreme leader of the police authority, which I was surprised he has this position to start with. And I thought that it's enough to have the guts to take those pictures and go to the general prosecutor to bring those people to accountability. But it wasn't enough, actually. I realized this a year later. And then next week, there was a demonstration at the same spot at the Press Syndicate. So what I did was I printed the picture of this police general. I enlarged it to a big poster, colored. And I took it and I stood there to tell them that we know you and we will be after you. I wanted to expose him. And unfortunately, I don't know who that man is until today. He did not stand any trials or anything, because a year later, the general prosecutor closed the case for not being able to identify the perpetrators. Although it's very easy to know a man on duty in that street at that time, who he was, and he has a picture. But they just decided not to hold anybody accountable. Today, Mubarak and Habib al-Adli are both facing charges, but I believe they are very loose charges, and they are not being charged for my case, my personal case. And Mubarak is lying in a 5-star hospital that, I don't really believe that the case is being well handled. And that was 2005. Now we move to the 9th of March 2011, after the revolution erupted in Egypt. The army, which was now controlling the country, stormed Tahrir Square sit-in and arrested an average of 18 women. who were in the protest. They tortured them, they put them in military prison, and then they subjected them to virginity tests. Samira Ibrahim was one of them, and she came out of this terrible experience. She's a veiled young woman, Egyptian woman. She came out of this terrible experience with the support of her father. She also filed a complaint against the army. She had the guts, and she also believed that it's enough to have the courage to expose people and to hold them accountable. So Samira went to the administrative court, which gave her a good sentence and ordered a military an investigation with the military. But a year later, which actually happens to be just yesterday, the military acquitted the army doctor who subjected Samira forcefully to the virginity test. So what happens in a country when you can't hold people accountable via the legitimate ways? You then go to public accountability. You ask for the solidarity of the people, and you make pressure, and you win your right back with your own hands. So today, we have different groups working on exposing the military rule in Egypt. One of them is an online and offline active group called No to Military Trials. It's a very popular movement. When it started, I could not believe how it will spread this fast and how it will have this big membership. They operate with a hashtag on Twitter, No Mil Trials, and if you're on Twitter, I urge you to follow them. Now, this campaign is working very aggressively on documenting all the army misachievements, torture of people, arrests, and blah, 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 and they're connecting with people, with mothers on the ground, with people in jail, and with the media. They have an English website, and they're doing great work. Another campaign is called Kaziboun in Arabic, which is in English called liars. And these people take the videos that are posted online everywhere showing what the army is doing in Egypt. And they took these videos and they make public screenings in the street, scheduled and announced in the open before that. And they go to the upscale neighborhoods from Zamalek in Cairo to the slums in the governorates. They go everywhere with those videos, and they are gaining a lot of support because images tell people really what happened. And some other groups work on an initiative called Tweet Shera in Arabic, which in English would be street tweets. They also announce on Twitter that they will hold a tweet discussion on a certain spot, and they go there and they talk with the people, and then they update live what's happening there on the streets, and it's a chance to meet people who you wouldn't meet by coincidence. And what we have learned is that you get a lot of credibility when you risk yourself and you go physically, not just sit behind your screen. When you go physically to the people and they see you as blood and flesh, not as a Twitter name or a hashtag. And another initiative was Tweet Nadwa, which is a Twitter panel, where people would come and speak in a panel like this, but every speaker would be only allowed 140 seconds instead of 140 characters. And there will be the hashtag will be running on a screen all the time with all the updates and the debates between different people who are in the room and outside the room as well. One other thing that proved very supportive to the civil society movement was forming something called the Front to Defend Egypt's Protesters. And this was formed a long time before the revolution. This came to being because of our trial and error. Actually, we realized that after every demonstration, after every big demonstration, everybody is squeezed. You're running after who's arrested, who's killed, who's injured, and you don't know what to do, and blah, blah, blah. So we decided to organize, and we formed the Front to Defend Egypt Protesters. It's composed of online activists, lawyers, bloggers, doctors, volunteers, translators. And what they do is, before the demonstration takes place, they set up a control room in one of the human rights centers in Egypt. And everybody gathers there and already follows up. And they are ready to go after the arrested people in police station and to attend interrogations with them and so on. One of the most important outcomes of this group is that they created a user manual, a printed user manual. And one of the most important chapters there was, what do you do when the internet is switched off? And they basically tell the people and prepare them in advance, because nobody ever expected the internet will be switched off in Egypt, that when you don't have your Twitter and Facebook, you open your Bluetooth, you connect to people, and you find alternative ways to share the information. Now, along the way in all this struggle, we learned some tactics that I'll share with you, just 3 points of it. Number one, that we should not divide or campaign based on religion, because it was very wrong in the in the recent constitutional amendments battle that we were divided into the secular groups and the religious groups, and this is wrong, actually. When we do it this way, we lose. We should be, all the political battles should be based on the agenda. What's your agenda? What's my agenda? It's not who is with Article number 2 in the Constitution and who is against Article number 2 in the Constitution. The second tactic is to play on multiple bets. We should play on different causes, press freedom, labor rights, social justice, and so on and so on and so on. And so on. And you never know which will be the winning cause. And also we play with multiple players. We have on board some TV stars, presidential candidates, workers, and most importantly, football fans and others. And the third tactic was to take them by surprise. So for example, they launched this silly attack on the NGOs in an attempt, I believe, to discredit the Egyptian civil society and the human rights movement in Egypt. And they call on cutting the USAID and the foreign funding to Egypt. And what we do, we join their call. Please cut the aid on Egypt and stop the military aid first before the civil society aid. And the second thing is, we are fielding a civil society young revolutionary man, we believe one of the faces of the revolution, to the presidential race. So they tried to push us somewhere and we pushed them back somewhere else. I'll look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nora. Thank you. They certainly have more than 140 seconds to speak, but I'm very aware that we started 7 minutes late, so I'm keeping everybody to their 8 to 10 minute slot. Now, Salwa, if you can give us your thoughts. She's going to speak about mostly how the legacy of the Qadhafi regime determined the nature of the protests in Libya and what kind of activism is necessary to overcome the enduring power of that legacy.
Your Excellencies, Ministers, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, please allow me to express my great appreciation for granting me the honor to stand here before you. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of our friends that extended a helping hand to our revolution all over the world. Almost exactly a year ago, the world responded to our agonizing cries with one of the biggest humanitarian gestures in the history of the UN and Security Council, which materialized in the 1970 and 1973 Security Council resolutions. One, the upcoming 19th of this month, the world should celebrate the prevention of what could have been one of the biggest crimes in the history of humanity. But I assume that everybody knows that the Libyan people's suffering was not restricted to the period of the revolution, but had actually started shortly after Qadhafi came to power in September of 1969. Early on during his rule, he started consolidating the power in his hands and dismantling the various state institutions, military, educational, and others, in preparation for turning the whole nation to a field of social, economic, and psychological control experiments. Libya's oil revenues enabled him to subsidize basic commodities and services to ensure a minimum of popular contentment, while he manipulated every little details of people's life and exercised total control of the country, and subjected the people to what I would call comprehensive repression. For it touched all aspects of person's life, social, economic, psychological, and political. Libya is one of the most resource-rich countries in Africa. Its levels of oil production and small population should have enabled the country to reach a level of development that would be envied by its neighbors in terms of infrastructure and public facilities. It always should have enabled the country to make progress in diversifying its revenues away from oil to more sustainable alternatives such as tourism, technology, solar energy, and others. After 40 years of Qadhafi's rule, Libya's infrastructure is nowhere near the standards of other developing countries. Its public facilities, airports, schools, hospitals, water treatment plants, and others are in a sorry state. Untreated sewage is dumped into the sea. Libyans travel in droves to seek medical treatment in neighboring countries. Its schools are run down and overcrowded with insufficient space for its very young population. Furthermore, Libya is more dependent on oil revenues than ever. After pouring billions in failed agricultural and industrial projects, the country is actually in a worse position in terms of self-reliance than it was 4 decades ago, due to the destruction of small-scale agriculture, fishing, and handicrafts by misguided government policies. Why is that, one might ask? The answer lies in the nature and policies of the Qadhafi's regime. To stay in power, Qadhafi sought to destroy all structure that might challenge his rule. He maintained the country in a continuous state of turmoil and chaos that reflected on every aspect of the economy and administrations. His third world theory and the changing interpretation he gave it over time would have led the country into starvation if it were not for the oil income. Qadhafi also relied on another tool to stay in power, corruption. Corruption was used to reward loyalists and then to blackmail them with it if they veered from their path. The level of corruption worsened considerably when Qadhafi's 7 sons and his daughter started exercising a role in Libya's economy with no one to stand in their way. Libya today faces enormous challenges to rebuild a rational, viable economy and move away with it from full reliance on oil income. It's not only skills and knowledge that are needed, but a change of attitude of a major part of the population towards their country's wealth, how it should be used, and how its benefits are to be shared. The assistance of Libya's friends, advanced countries, and international organizations is indispensable to put the country on the right path towards real and sustainable development. We do realize that our rebuilding process is going to be difficult and dangerous, but by looking at what has been achieved over the last year, despite the institutional and political void inherited from Qadhafi, I can only describe it as remarkable. The press or media have been revived, and civil society organizations are being empowered. And these, I believe, are the most effective tool to ensure the democratization of a new Libya through a constitution that will ensure and protect our democratic aspiration. I believe that the most important and immediate of our challenges is stabilizing the country, and that can only be realized by rebuilding a national army to control our border and safeguard the constitution, not the ruler. A national reconciliation process has to be initiated, and this can only be attained by a just system that is strong, independent, and transparent, and the necessary preparation for our upcoming election. Looking at today's political atmosphere in Libya, we find to be quite rich and dynamic. A lot of contradictions, but I believe it to be normal and healthy, despite the poor performance of our NTC and transitional government, and the widespread presence of weapons. Very minor armed confrontations have been witnessed and were quickly controlled by the nature of our social fabric and homogeneous religious affiliation. Finally, I would like to emphasize that was as Libyans believe in ourselves and in our commitment to democracy and aversion to dictatorship, we need our international friends to believe in and have faith in us and continue their highly valued and appreciated support. No doubt that we have a heavy burden that can only be carried through a collective international effort. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Salwa. And Salwa has actually been working hard to influence the new government. She traveled to Tunisia to look at the experiment there and see what she could learn for Libya's experience, and we might have a chance to raise that later. Okay, we have about half an hour for questions now. That's a limited time, so could we please get questions and not statements? The more succinct you are, the more we can include. Just raise your hand and we'll send a microphone over to you, and please hold the microphone steady so we actually get your question, and also identify who you are. Anybody have a question? Go ahead. In this corner here.
Hi, to start off, Jeff Laurenti with the Century Foundation. Particularly to Secretary Hague, the international community has been making a massive investment in another largely Muslim country, Afghanistan, that's been somewhat rocky in terms of trying to nurture accountability and civil and democratic institutions, and a smaller subset of the international community tried in Iraq. What kind of learning curve should we take from those experiences to help guide international policy with regard to supporting transition and change in the Arab countries along the Mediterranean that have been experiencing upheaval now? Are there do's, and particularly are there do-nots that come out of that?
Right, well, I must hesitate to make up a lot of rules on the spur of the moment about this do's and do-nots, but I think the first thing to say is that all these countries are different. You're mentioning there Afghanistan and Iraq, and they're not only radically different from each other in many ways, but the countries, as I was pointing out briefly in my earlier remarks, the countries across North Africa are different in many ways. Their political traditions have been different. This complete absence of institutional government in Libya is a different problem from the problem in Egypt, let us say. Some countries are, we hope, successfully embarking on peaceful constitutional change. Others have been through revolutions of varying degrees of violence. So the first thing is to respect how different they are. I think the Arab nations have greater differences in culture between each other than most European nations have between each other. And we have a lot of differences. So, you only have to look at the different political traditions of Britain and France and all the differences that produces in the way we elect our leaders, the things we eat, all sorts of things. Big differences. But in the Arab world, some of these are even bigger. In Syria, which has this, as we have seen, an authoritarian police state that is now embarked on murdering thousands of its own people. Actually, in other ways, it has been a more liberal society than some of the other Arab nations in terms of the involvement of women, protection of minorities. And unfortunately, it has a deeply repressive state put on the top of that culture. So respecting the complexity of other nations and cultures of other nations is, I think, the most fundamentally important rule here that we are looking for. And that means that there isn't an outside model. There is no, it means when we say that other countries should be democratic and open, they are not going to adopt a model of the Westminster Parliament or of the United States Congress. We must have the patience and have the understanding of them that they will find their own way to their model of democracy. I think that is probably the most important thing, because I don't want to take us too much into Iraq and Afghanistan on a discussion about other things, but some of the difficulties of people thinking from outside that they know what the right political structure of the country is are evident in those countries. So maybe I'll come to avoid talking all afternoon about this, I will content myself to that one very fundamental rule.
I'm just going to interject with my own question here at this point. I wanted to ask you, Nora. You come from a secular tradition, a liberal tradition, and the government that has taken power in Egypt now is Islamist. So what does that mean for you as an activist? Do you see areas where you can work together with the Islamist government, like areas where you have to be in opposition to them? I mean, what are your tactics in terms of where you can be in alliance and where you can be in opposition?
Actually, the parliament is now Islamist. The government is still going to be. So.
Right, the parliament, all right.
Yeah. Actually, we pressured the Muslim Brotherhood majority parliament to take power, to take on the government. We want them to take the government as well. And I'm talking about myself and part of also secular activists and friends. And this is because we want them to be held accountable. We just don't want them to be in the parliament and speaking from a position where we cannot hold them accountable on things. So the Islamists coming to power is not the end of the route. Actually, we think it's very positive because it's a phase it's a path we have to go anyway. So better take it now and get over with it very quickly. And I think it's a very bad time in Egypt to be in power, basically for anyone. So I really think they are very unlucky.
The lady in the middle there.
Thank you. I'm Raghida Dargham of Al Hayah, but also I have founded recently an Arab think tank called Beirut Institute, and I'll tell you, there's a lot of people who hold a completely opposite view to yours, Mona. They do not feel that the way to find their rights is through the failure of the Islamists in government. They cannot afford to wait. In fact, a conversation is taking place that the constitutions that are being drawn now by these parliaments that are Islamists would probably lead to further renouncing or denouncing or giving up civil rights, including women's rights. Therefore, I think sometimes it's over-celebrated to say, don't worry about it. Women in particular, we here are very worried about it because they are worried about what the constitutions are going to be like, their rights in these constitutions. So
Raghida, your question?
they're referring to it as an Islamic spring. I am challenging the view here that let's celebrate it and not worry about it. That's my question. I want an answer to my question.
Can I?
Salwa, yeah, you've had some activity on this matter in Libya recently, haven't you?
In Libya, I want to tell you that we are learning from the experience of Egypt and Tunisia. And I've been in Tunisia during their election. And now in Libya, we are afraid that maybe after three months, it's going to be the same. We want, all Libyan ideology inside the national parliament. That's why now we are trying to take from the experience from Tunis, because there were more than 80 parties establishing after the revolution, and they paid the price because of the disorganization and poor strategy consideration. And because of that, we have to face it in Libya. We try to we established already 2 weeks ago a coalition. This coalition, there were 40 parties in the coalition, and civil societies and individual. Why is that? Because the NTC and the government, they didn't establish party laws. So now all these people together, these 40 parties and the civil society, they can go for the election as one group. So maybe we hope that we can achieve our goal and our target to be there, and going to be Muslim Brotherhood, Salafi, and liberal, and no ideology in the so it will be Libyans inside the not just the Islamist parties.
So the coalition is what? It's to establish a stand against the Islamist parties?
Not against, but it's our right to be there.
But you're giving you're giving an alternative to Islamist
Yes,
parties. Right?
yeah. So because we knew that the Muslim Brotherhood, they are very organized, they have structure, they know exactly how to work, and they have their people already. So they are, they have, you know, I think if we didn't do this coalition, we can't reach the parliament and the election. So that's why we are preparing ourselves.
Oh, lots of questions. Okay, we'll here and then Richard.
Hi, my name is Talal Hash from Al Arabiya News Channel. In Libya, the world community came to your rescue with 1970 and 1973, and there was a coalition of the willing and NATO, and they went ahead and helped you in your revolution. In Egypt, the army stood still and did not take the side of the government and Mubarak and turn against the people. However, in Syria, the world is not moving due to the abstinence of Russia and China in the Security Council, and the army has taken sides and is turning its guns against the people. What chances do you give, both of the ladies, to the Syrian revolution to succeed without too much bloodshed? And my question to you, sir, you spoke about that the West, I think something to that effect, should accept the choice of the people of the government they want. With the remarks made earlier that once, for example, the Muslims come to the power in Egypt, they could change the constitution, and they need to win once, maybe. How worrying is that to the West? Thank you.
Your question to the activist was how soon?
How do they see the revolution? In the case of Libya, the international community, NATO, came to the rescue. In the case of Egypt, the army did not turn their guns against the people.
So what chances did the revolution in Syria
In Syria, there's nobody's coming to the rescue, and the army has turned against the people.
So those are quite big questions, but all three of you have been asked. So I ask if you can try to keep your comments reasonably brief, and I'll go to the Foreign Secretary first on the question that was asked to you. So give the lady some time to think.
Yes, thank you. How worried are we? Well, I think we should. I think we should judge people over time by what they do, rather than by trying to put them into boxes and saying, you know, those are good ones, those are bad ones. That's true in the rest of the world. That should be true in this part of the world. I think the parties that are based on, that are rooted in Islam will vary enormously, again, from each other. After all, parties that in Europe that call themselves Christian vary enormously from each other. And so we should expect that to happen. Of course, it is very important in our view for any parties in any democracy in the world that they are opposed to violence, that they respect changes of government, that they accept a change of government if it is voted for. Otherwise, they're not upholding the democracy that people have clearly longed for. So while, of course, we should pass a harsh judgment on any parties that don't respect those things, we shouldn't expect to have all of the time governments that we agree with in every respect. Or whose policies that we will necessarily approve of in every respect. That's not true anywhere else in the world. Why should it be true in the Middle East? So that's why I said earlier, we have to have some patience, and we have to have respect for the sovereignty of these countries and the good sense of the people of these countries, provided they have that freedom and right to make their own decisions. That is something we should unequivocally stand for. So how worried are we by it? Well, I think, we of course must have many worries according to just the events we see week to week, day by day. And while we celebrate it, to couple this with answering the previous question, I'm not saying celebrate what has happened and don't worry about it. I'm saying celebrate what has happened and do worry about it, because there will be so many things that have to be achieved in these countries. And there are so many ways in which we can help. But we should not be put off by labels or be more frightened than we need to be. by people's rhetoric. Let us give them a chance to succeed and to show what they can do, is my overall philosophy on this.
So, Nora, in Egypt, the military stood back during the protests, and that's not happening in Syria. What chance do you think the Syrian revolution has?
Well, I don't believe the military in Egypt really stood back. But the Syrian people really amaze us and make us feel very ashamed when we watch what's happening. And their bravery is just incredible. I mean, every time they take out, the only bet that each individual has is that he is not going to be the one killed today. This is the bet they have. They are not betting on anyone else or anything else. And because of the severity of the bloodshed in Syria, I do believe they have a chance and they will come out of it, because once it comes to blood, there is no way back. It has to continue. The price will be very high, but it will be higher with an armed international intervention. So I really hope we avoid this. And the Syrian situation was going to be much, much better if there were no international players involved in a negative way, like, for example, Iran and China and Russia. So I really hope that it would have been left to the Syrians to finish their own revolution on their own. And in this moment, I don't think we should also forget what's happening in Bahrain, because even Bahrain, surprisingly, is not getting enough coverage on Arab televisions, which is very shameful as well.
Salwa, you had NATO to help you win your war. Do you think the Syrian opposition stands a chance without something similar, which it doesn't seem to be able to get?
I don't think so.
Do you think it should?
It should, but there's a completely different situation between Libya and Syria. If there's possibility to Qadhafi to stay until now, he will try to let the Tunisian revolution and the Egyptian revolution to let them fail, because he's worried. And for me, I don't think that they are the same situation between Syria and Libya. But for Libya, I'm really optimistic. And I know that we have enormous challenges, but we are, there's a long way, a road ahead for us. But there is no backward. We have actually to go forward.
Quick question here from Twitter, from the handle Acid Aval. He says, or she, do you regret supporting protests if the result is Islamists in power? I think we've kind of covered this. Is there anybody else who wants to add something? We'll just give a note to Acid Aval and move on. Richard, I said you were next, didn't I?
Thank you. Richard Barrett from the Al-Qaeda Taliban monitoring team. You all rightly said that the people should determine their future, their government and their leadership. I wonder if there's any difference when it comes to issues of national cohesion, where the maintenance of existing borders or the creation of new states. Of course, it's slightly relevant in the Libyan case, and it's not meant to be a question about Scottish devolution, by the way.
Who would like to take that question? Foreign Secretary?
Have we understood the question correctly? I think is what the panel would like to know. You're asking about self-determination, how far you take self-determination. Yes. Well, ultimately, that is certainly our view in the United Kingdom is that that is itself a matter of democracy in the long run. Certainly, you said it's not a question about Scottish devolution, but of course our position is that we will hold a referendum in Scotland on Scottish independence, and it is up to the people of Scotland to decide what to do. That will be true in other parts of the world, and it should be true in other countries as well. But I don't think we should understand the resolution that was carried in one part of Libya last week as indicating the breakup of the country. My fellow panelists may have more views about that. There are different regions. There are the three distinct regions. But I think that was more, I have understood it or as pressure for their interest to be taken into account than to see the breakup of Libya. But certainly over time, I think people do have the right to self-determination, and that must be respected.
Salwa, do you want to comment on that briefly? I mean, is there a lot of support in eastern Libya for this declaration of federation or semi-autonomy? Do you see that as a big problem?
Yeah, there were last week they announced that group 1,500 people that they named the Council of Federal, and the president was Ahmed Zubair Sunusi. He's a member in the NTC. But then after 2 days of that announced that the people in eastern country, there were a big demonstration, and I was there, more than 100,000 in the streets, and they said we don't want federal, and because we know in the future. It must be like when you say the federal, that after that we will divide our country to 3 parts, and we want one Libya from the beginning. We said that it's one Libya. Even after 4 months of our revolution, there's many political talks about maybe they will divide. There's maybe Qadhafi talked about that and his sons and. But we said that we want to go to the end because we want Libya united and we don't want to divide our country. So we said our word there and it's over yet.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.
The gentleman over there.
Thank you very much. Patrick Hayford from the United Nations Secretariat. Foreign Secretary, thank you very much, and the other panelists. A question to Ms. Yunus from Egypt. What are the prospects that the secular liberal forces will be able to come together and form a counterweight to the other forces in your country? And what are the prospects that the military will be ready to effectively let go some of the power they've accumulated? And to Ms. Bugaighis from Libya, there's a lot of concern in much of the rest of Africa about the relationship between Libya and especially its Sahelian neighbors. We know you're very busy with internal issues, but would you care to say a few words about the thinking in the new dispensation about the relationship, especially with your Sahelian neighbors? Thank you.
Nora, do you want to answer the first question?
Yeah. Well, actually, your first question was actually what we have learned that it's wrong to do. It's wrong to come out together as seculars against the Islamists, because then you lose, basically. And we learned it the hard way. Like, we did organize this way and we lost. So we now know that this is not the way to do it. It's actually the best way to do it is what can we offer to the people and what do the people want? Because it's not an ideological debate of whether white people. If you tell the people, like, would you want to be run by Islamists, by Islamists or by seculars? They are afraid of the word secular, and it's a very unpopular word in itself. But what can the seculars give and what can the Islamists give to the people? That's what's important, and that's what the people have to make the choices upon. And this is why we look at the causes and why the revolution started. They want people, regular people, not politicized people, regular people, wanted freedom and wanted social justice and wanted democracy. And these are things all the seculars are interested in, and they want to give and they can give. What about the Islamists? Can they give freedom? Can they give social justice? We don't think so, because the interests of the Islamic groups are very much tied to an economic structure that's very similar to Mubarak's structure. So most probably the Islamist government is going to present same government structure, same economic policies like the ones used to be with the Mubarak time. This is why I'm personally very optimistic, and I want to give them a chance because I can see where they are going. And about the army giving up power, it's very difficult because the army is not just Tantawi who is running the country now. The army goes from Nasser. We've been run by the army for a very, very long time, actually since President Nasser. And because I'm a journalist, I know how much we gained in the past time, because right before the revolution, the word army was a red line. I cannot write it on the website. I cannot publish the word army without running my story first by the Army PR office to approve it, even if it's a coverage of the football game where the Army football team was playing, and this is a coverage of the game. They also have to approve it as well. Now we are running many stories against the Army and very publicly, and they object, and we continue publishing about it. So all the Egyptian society in all its segments are giving the army a very hard time. And I know that they don't want to give up power, and I know that they want a safe exit out of their position now, because actually Tantawi is committing the same crimes Mubarak committed. He is killing protesters. He's responsible for the killing of protesters. He's responsible for manipulating the media, for everything. Like all the charges now against Mubarak, if you just replace the names, you'll find them also viable. So what they want is a safe exit, and the Egyptian society is giving them a very hard time with it. Are they going to leave power? Yes, eventually, I believe so. How soon? We are doing all our best.
Salwa, do you have any thoughts about how the new Libya, what sort of relationships it might have with its immediate neighbors who were benefited from the relationship with Qadhafi?
About as you said, that they are our neighbors, and we are Africans too. And I'm optimistic because we have to deal with all the world. We have to respect each other. We have to save our borders. We will talk about this, and I'm really optimistic about our future. I know now it's cloudy, and maybe, as I said, that we have enormous challenges, but I'm really optimistic about the future for Libya. And if there's a will, there's a way, and you will see.
Okay, this man over there, and then Evelyn, and then I think we'll probably have to draw it to a close. If you could keep your questions brief.
Very brief. Since nobody mentioned Yemen, including the Foreign Secretary, I would like to draw two lessons from Yemen. One, there is consensus that federalism is, after all, better than excessive centralization, because excessive centralization leads to resentment in provinces. Two, I think, in answer to Raghida, I think we are worried about the Islamic trend, and Yemen is no exception. But I believe they will be defeated once they take power, because you have to differentiate between preaching and exercising power. My question is to the Foreign Secretary. How do you assess the so-called Arab-Russian agreement in Cairo? I think it is very negative in terms of the struggle of the Syrian people. But I wanted to take your view on that.
Thank you. Yes, apologies for not mentioning Yemen, which we should have done, of course. A different case, it again illustrates actually how very different each country can be. And you make the point about federation rather than centralization. That may well be true in Yemen. It won't be true in every country. Of course, no country wants excessive centralization. But in Yemen, there is a particular structure and a particular history, and it's not so long since it came together as a united country. So clearly, the need for regional decision-making is very strong in a country like that, and we should respect that. How do we assess the talks between the Russian foreign minister and the Arab League? Well, it's always a positive thing diplomatically when people are talking about it together. And we've been doing so today in the Security Council and in the margins of the Security Council. Now, what that leads to remains to be seen. And of course, there are many moving parts to this at the moment. The visit of Kofi Annan to Damascus and any response that the Assad regime makes to that. We're continuing to work in the Security Council on trying to arrive at a resolution, because the truth is that the Security Council has failed so far in its responsibilities to the people of Syria. And we are working on that together, including talking to Russia in great detail and to China about the way forward, regretting deeply as we do the vetoing of 2 resolutions over the last 6 months. So I don't think it's a bad thing that Russia and the Arab League were able to point the way to some things that they had in common, and together to point the way to a political process, and for there to be some modification in the words that the Russian foreign minister used. I think those are positive developments in what is a very, very difficult and intractable problem. But we must continue to work on it. Maybe I will say a further word about Syria in my closing remarks.
Just quickly, Evelyn, do we have a microphone?
Barbara says Evelyn. Right. Could you, Secretary Hague, could you say something about responsibility to protect? We went through Rwanda, Srebrenica led to the concept, and I've heard Minister Lavrov today and at other occasions constantly refer to the charter, and by that in Libya and Syria he means interference in state affairs and in a particular country's affairs, and all the apologists for Syria use the same argument.
Well, this is one of the big long-running debates in foreign policy. Clearly we in the United Kingdom, we are very strongly committed to a belief in universal human rights, and we do believe that there is a responsibility to protect. We have to reconcile that with our belief in the sovereignty and territorial integrity of other nations. So it still means there is a judgment about what you do. It doesn't mean there is a hard and fast rule about what you do in every situation. There are other countries where we have some vigorous debates with some nations around the world who say they are strong supporters of human rights, but they are always, they favor non-intervention. And I have some fascinating debates behind the scenes with those foreign ministers, where I say, well, sometimes you have to intervene. Sometimes it is your responsibility to do so. And clearly we take that view. We did so in Libya. We fought very hard for that resolution, and then we took immediate action based on the resolution. And it, as you said earlier, that perhaps averted what might have been one of the worst events of modern times in Benghazi. It doesn't mean that you can do so in every situation, because first of all, you do need the legal basis for it, which would often involve, although many would argue it doesn't always involve, a United Nations resolution. And I think it has to be effective, to do it, to make it worth doing, to make it something that improves the safety and the lives of the people involved. You have to be fairly confident that it will be effective. And that, of course, is both of those difficulties arise in the case of Syria. That is why it is a different situation. It is morally the same situation as in Libya. Morally, absolutely the same. But it is different in practice because of the differing positions on the UN Security Council, and because in the case of Syria there is a greater risk of creating a wider conflict or greater loss of life than was the case in Libya, and a greater risk of causing events that spill over into neighboring states than would have been the case in Libya. So each case is different, but we strongly support the concept of the responsibility to protect, and we hope that everywhere, that civil society, that NGOs, that nations that think the same way we do will engage in debate those countries that seem to set their face always against any intervention, even when the most fundamental human rights are at stake.
Thank you. I think we'll have to draw the questions to a close, and I'm going to be asking the Foreign Secretary to give his concluding remarks, followed by Mr. Terje Rød-Larsen. But because I'm a journalist, I'm going to spark it off with two tiny questions myself. And that is, I wanted to ask you a foreign policy question. Do you think that, what effect do democratic, accountable governments in the Middle East have for British foreign policy? For example, if you look at the Egyptian government, which is now against the Mubarak policy of blockading Gaza. It sees Hamas as a sister organization, as a legitimate representative of the people in Gaza, but also in the region. And Britain, of course, sees Hamas as a terrorist organization. Does this create problems for Britain? Is it sometimes, would it have perhaps been easier to deal with the autocrats like President Mubarak? And for Mr. Rød-Larsen, we have a Twitter question here for you as well. You have visited Bahrain recently. How does it compare to the other Arab Springs?
Well, just to begin, just a very short few concluding remarks with reference to that question. It of course, might look on paper simpler or easier to deal with autocrats. But in the long run, it is better to deal with societies whose stability is rooted in the people of their country being able to make their own decisions. Now, I had this discussion actually a couple of years ago with one of the Mubaraks, with Gamal Mubarak. I had a discussion with him in Cairo saying what you really need in the next elections in Egypt is a strong opposition to emerge. That is what your society needs. That's what your country really needs. And of course, the opposite happened. And our ambassador sent a report to London saying this is a disaster because it will lead to something much more violent than democratic change. Although, as it turned out, people brought about change in the least violent way they could. But it was dramatic and forced change rather than a democratic change. So it may look simpler, but I think in the end, based on all the beliefs that I've been expressing earlier, it is better for the foreign policy of liberal democratic societies to be dealing with societies that are also rooted in the instincts and the preferences and the choices of the people of those countries, even if you disagree with them some of the time. But as I said earlier, we're used to that. We disagree with, we sit at the European Council and we have lots of disagreements, of course. This is not unusual. It's not abnormal. It doesn't mean we've fallen out. It doesn't mean we're not friends. And that, I think, will be the case with many countries in the Arab world as well. Now, just to reflect for a few concluding moments from me, I think it's been fascinating to listen to my fellow panelists here and reflect on the sheer ingenuity and inventiveness of people who have helped to bring about this change, which is inspiring in itself, but also it illustrates the extent of the challenge when we hear about Libya, about the misuse of huge resources over time in what should be a naturally prosperous nation. That misuse of resources and misgovernment means it is a great economic challenge, an institutional challenge for the people of these countries. I think it is inspiring what has happened over the last year. When I think of the contrast, I was the first foreign minister to visit Tunis after the revolution. And it was still under curfew when I arrived. And all the way in from the airport to the British Embassy, I didn't see a single person move. I saw one cat cross the road, and that was all. And I went again to Tunis 2 weeks ago to the Friends of Syria meeting and saw the highways choked with traffic and everybody moving about in rush hour. And it was, in 1 year, an extraordinary contrast in a very, very positive way. And I think that is quite inspiring. And it was hugely inspiring to me to go to Benghazi last June at the height of the conflict in Libya. And it was when I heard the people there talking about what had happened over the previous 2 decades under the Qadhafi regime and how strongly they felt about it and how utterly committed they were to their freedom. Then I was absolutely convinced that they were going to succeed. It was not possible to say how long it would take, but I was in no doubt whatsoever that they were going to succeed. And I think we should respect and support that inspiring determination. And there will be many points at which people will say, well, it's all gone wrong, hasn't it? because that we live in this world of instant gratification. Every time there is a setback, when we are being interviewed on the media, well, this is no comment on very talented interviewers, they will say, so it's all gone wrong, hasn't it? So it is now a disaster. Well, actually, there will be many setbacks and disappointments, but you will have to see over a much longer period of time whether or not it is a success, and I believe that it will be, because it is based on real human rights, and it has, I think the experience in the Arab world the last year has reminded us that human rights are universal. When the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it meant universal. And the idea that there is a group of people in any region who are too apathetic or too lacking in any care for their own dignity or choices, that they are not interested in their human rights, is wrong. And it would be wrong anywhere in the world, and it's turned out to be wrong in the Arab world. So all of that is good, but it, of course, among the setbacks, among the difficulties, where autocratic rulers attempt to stay in power by force, as we are seeing in Syria now, it creates bloodshed that is deeply frustrating and distressing to the rest of the world. And that is why, while there are all the considerations and barriers to the use of force to protect people that we have been discussing, we are looking at every way of assisting the people of Syria in so many different ways, through humanitarian assistance, through supporting the work of Kofi Annan, through seeking resolutions in which we failed so far at the United Nations Security Council. In the case of Britain, we are helping to document human rights abuses, crimes against humanity, so that people can have some confidence that those crimes, that justice will be found for those crimes in the future. And we will continue intensifying this work as this terrible situation goes on. But I've hugely enjoyed being on this panel with my colleagues and listening to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Having listened very carefully to the panelists, I think there are three questions which springs to mind. The first is, was all this predictable? The second is, where are we heading? And the third is, which actually nobody touched upon, is what are the consequences for the political landscape of the region, for the political power relations in the region? To the first question, my answer is yes, it was predictable. My answer to the second question is, it is unpredictable where we are heading. And to the third question, it is, yes, massively. The geopolitical landscape is changing massively. Let me look into the first question first, and I'll do it very briefly. I went for a tour of the region 3 months before it started in Tunisia and Egypt. I spoke to several, if not all, the relevant intelligence chiefs in many of the neighboring countries, if I may put it that way. I spoke to prime ministers, foreign ministers, heads of state, etc. And I asked the same question to all of them, what's going to happen to Egypt? And they laughed at me and said, Egypt is completely stable, nothing is going to happen. Then I went to Egypt and I had dinner with the then Secretary General of the Arab League, Amr Moussa, and he looked at me and he said, this country is going to explode. We will be hit by a political hurricane within the next few months. And I laughed at him, reading that this was a guy who had political aspirations and this was wishful thinking. He was right. And if we look at the numbers today, actually, we could also have predicted it if we'd done our homework properly. Because if we, for instance, look at Gallup's so-called thriving index, that is, are people satisfied with their lives in the societies they are living? If we look at Syria, Egypt, Yemen, Libya, and Tunisia, there has been an average of 11% drop in the number of people who thought they were thriving in the years from 2009 to 2007. In all the other Arab countries, it increased by an average of 6%. All these countries were at the very bottom of the list. If we look at freedom of expression, what we see on the index is that in these countries which are listed, only 10% of the population had been voicing their opinion to a public official, in contrast to an average of 19% in other Arab countries. An average of 33% of the people reported that they had a very negative outlook on living conditions and where the economy was heading, and the numbers are exactly the same. It's heaping up in these countries. You could see that there was a deep dissatisfaction here. And of course, what made the upheavals possible was not the internet, actually, because it's only the UAE and Lebanon who has double-digit numbers of people who are using the internet, respectively, I think it's 15 and 22%. The internet doesn't play a significant role in the other countries. However, 90% of the households have cell phones. And if we look at Egypt, for instance, 84% of the population were looking at television. And the viewers, this is very interesting, of Jazeera, 5-doubled. And thanks to Talal here, you won't believe this, with your reporting from New York, those who looked at your television station increased 20-fold over that period. So it's a combination of these social factors, the communication tools, and of course the leadership from some of the people who are sitting in this panel which produced it. So yes, we should have all watched this much more carefully, and Amr Moussa was right in his categorical answer to me. So where are we heading? And this is a crucial question, and I think if I should use a word in a nutshell here, I would say it's unpredictable. This can go very bad, it can go very well, it can go between, it can take a short period of time, it can take a long period of time. But I think what we saw, particularly at the beginning in many Western media, there was a kind of utopian, revolutionary romanticism of democracy, which was frankly pretty naive. If we look at two other waves of revolution in fairly recent history, Eastern Europe, and if we go back to 1848, in 1848 nearly all the revolutions went bad. The autocrats came back again because there was no regional incentive systems to stay. When it went bad for so many countries, but when it went good for so many countries, not all, in Eastern Europe, it's in my opinion of one major reason. And that is that there were regional institutional mechanisms which you had to qualify for to become a member of, namely the European Union and the NATO. And I do strongly believe that unless there are regional institutional mechanisms, and I think this Foreign Secretary is one of the best ways we can help, that is to either to use existing institutional structures to create incentives or create new institutional mechanisms on a regional basis where you institutionalize incentives to move in the right direction. And unless such institutions are in place, I think everything here is unpredictable. I took notice that Nora Yunus, I'm not quoting you, but this is what I deduct from what you said, is that actually what we still have in Egypt is a military dictatorship. There hasn't taken place a revolution. There was an upheaval, but still the same power structures, but with different personalities, are in place, and you exemplified it with many examples. So here we have to watch this extremely carefully. There is now underway work on a new constitution in Egypt. The shape and form and content of that constitution is going to be absolutely crucial for the future of Egypt. Are there incentives to move that constitution in the right direction? And do the donors, many of them being present in this hall, do they think when they give donations to create such incentives linked to the money? I think this is the crucial issue for answering the question on where we are heading. Then very briefly on the geopolitical balance, in brief, I could elaborate a lot on this. I think that US and Western influence in the region is waning. The traditional diplomatic powers like Egypt and some of the Gulf countries is also waning. And in comes a country like Turkey, who has become a key regional player, filling some of the vacuum which the US and Egypt has left behind. And in a way, paradoxically, a tiny little country, which is small in size and small in population, namely Qatar, has become a lead diplomatic player in the region. As one head of state told me the other day in the region, he said, Qatar has become the leader of the Arab world. And that's a paradox, my friends, when we look back on a year ago, which was the big powers with lots of money and a big military. So in that vacuum, the political landscape is changing very rapidly. I saw a poll recently where just 2 years ago, the two most popular personalities, the idols of the region, were Nasrallah and Ahmadinejad. They are at the bottom now, and at the top we find the Prime Minister of Turkey. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for coming, and to those of you who watched us live on our webcast, and to those of you who sent us Twitter questions. Thank you for the participants for keeping the debate democratic in the spirit of the revolutions about which we're talking. And just as a very final comment, I'd like to say, as somebody who has lived and worked in the Middle East for a long time, whatever the challenges of these new democracies are, I found this all very inspiring, that we're not continually talking about the need for democracy in the Arab world. We're actually seeing it practiced and by the people themselves. So thank you very much.
Thank you.